We now turn our attention to one of the most successful and lauded stories of the post-World War II era in the United States, John Updike's A&P, which, like James Joyce's Araby, which, by the way, is also a central place of commerce, that's in the title, and a place that brings change for a young man, and like so many masterfully told stories, is an initiation story. It's no secret why initiation stories grab and command and hold our interest and attention, especially when they're so artfully rendered as this story is. They speak to us on a deep level of the journey we all take that is recognizable as a universal life odyssey from what the great British poet William Blake wrote about in his Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience. The recognition, or the epiphany, tied to maturation. It's often painful, but nevertheless is an awakening to the realities of life, to what Blake called in his poem The Tiger, life's fearful symmetry. That tiger is out there, it's ferocious and menacing, and it awaits all of us, as it does, for example, you may recall in Sonny's Blues, specifically called a tiger. A&P is a rites of passage or generation gap story, like Sonny's Blues, but it's also a story of class differences set in modern New England and written by one of America's leading fiction writers. John Updike is also a most prolific and award-winning writer of fiction, of novels, as well as short stories, and of poetry, essays, reviews, memoir, an opera, and a libretto. He wrote his first story at the age of 8 and published his most famous and popular and anthologized story, A&P, in The New Yorker, soon after his summa cum laude graduation from Harvard. He is one of those writers who's become very strongly identified with The New Yorker. Updike's personal history is relevant to the story. He was from a small town in Pennsylvania. Sammy, the A&P protagonist, is from a small town north of Boston, and like Updike, from a family of modest means. Updike's father was a junior high school teacher, and both Sammy and Updike are from a working class milieu. Like his adolescent character, Updike has long been identified as an author with a highly eroticized imagination. This story concerns Sammy's reaction to a trio of young women wearing only bathing suits who enter the supermarket where he works as a checkout boy. The girls saunter in. They make quite an impression on this young man and his co-worker, whose name is Stokesy, and both young men are smitten, while others in the supermarket are affected as well by the sight of something so unexpected and rare in this setting, visible female flesh. The three are eyed rather suspiciously by the women who are making their way with their shopping carts through the maze-like traffic in the store. Sammy bitingly calls these women sheep and house slaves. The three who come into the store are also sized up as meat by old McMahon, the store's butcher. And finally they're scolded and embarrassed and made to feel indecent by Lengel, the store manager, who upbraids them for not dressing decently. All of this serves as a catalyst for Sammy to act like a would-be Galahad, to quit his job and walk out in protest from the store with a dramatic flourish, only to realize that his quitting his job has not even crossed the threshold of the attention of any of the girls, including the one whom he is most drawn to, whom he has dubbed Queenie. That's the essential story, coming of age or move from innocence into the world of experience. But the uniqueness and strength of this story, as well as its popularity and the high praise it has received, all rest in the extraordinary facility with which Updike, like J.D. Salinger, manages, in his famous character Holden Caulfield in The Catcher in the Rye, to make us hear Sammy's voice and to accept it as authentic. Salinger, by the way, was a New Yorker protege over a decade before Updike and produced 13 short stories. But there's a difference in this story, where The Catcher in the Rye takes Holden Caulfield into a kind of pathology and mental disturbance. Sammy walks out and pretty much embarks on a different phase of his life and has gone through an experience which will shape his character and shape the rest of his life. He's a pretty ordinary kid for the most part. In fact, there are many things about him that are dislikable, but there are many also that are quite likable. It's a rounded character who Updike presents for us. When he finally hears Queenie, the character he calls Queenie, talk, he tells us that he slides down her voice into her living room and pictures vividly what her better class than his working class parents might look like. Updike's genius is allowing us to slide down Sammy's voice and imagine a real, live, complicated but highly imaginative, libidinous young boy on the threshold of manhood. Hear this voice. In walks these three girls in nothing but bathing suits. I'm in the third checkout slot with my back to the door, so I don't see them until they're over by the bread. The one that caught my eye first was the one in the plaid green two-piece. She was a chunky kid with a good tan and a sweet, broad, soft-looking can with those two crescents of white just under it, where the sun never seems to hit, at the top of the backs of her legs. I stood there with my hand on a box of hi-ho crackers trying to remember if I rang it up or not. I ring it up again, and the customer starts giving me hell. She's one of these cash register watchers, a witch about 50 with rouge on her cheekbones and no eyebrows, and I know it made her day to trip me up. She'd been watching cash registers for 50 years and probably never seen a mistake before. Well, you get a lot of attitude in that, but you also get these splendid details like hand on the hi-ho crackers, forgetting to ring up the register. In other words, he's very taken by what he sees here, and he's also quite mindful and conscious of, well, making fun of the people who come into the store, the house slaves, as he later calls them, the women. And this doesn't necessarily endear him to us. In fact, he talks about them as witches and says that they might have been burned at the stake if they were alive in Salem a few hundred years before that. But it's a kid copying an attitude, and it's an attitude that I think we're pretty understandable toward. We recognize as a part of maybe growing pains of adolescence. The young girls who enter the A&P in their bathing suits affect Sammy. They also affect his 22-year-old fellow employee, Stokesy. And it's important to mention that Stokesy is older, but also unlike Sammy, who's unshackled and free to walk off the job at the end, Stokesy is married with two kids. Two babies chalked up on his fuselage, Sammy informs us. As the diminutivized name Sammy suggests, Sammy's a boy. He's got a job because his parents have a friendship with the manager, Lengel, whose name intimates a kind of harshness, almost like the word mangle. Told you, don't necessarily put too much emphasis on names, but nevertheless, Lengel sounds pretty heavy. Sammy is a boy dressed in the apron and bow tie uniform of the A&P checker who still tied to his mother's apron strings. He's wearing a shirt which he tells us that his mother ironed for him to wear the night before. What his action reveals, is emblematic of a transition from boyhood to manhood, a break away from his parents, from their values, and into independence through an action that he tells us is ultimately sad from the point of view of his parents, but not, he says, so sad for him. Images of bathing suits with straps down and key signifiers like naked and bare all represent the erotic effect that the girls have, and especially of Queenie, on both Sammy and Stokesy. There's even an exchange between the two supermarket checkers of a kind of foul swooning. "Oh, Daddy," Stokesy said beside me, "I feel so faint." "Darling," I said, "hold me tight." Yet Sammy also feels compassion for the girls, beginning with their being seen by the butcher who is patting his mouth and looking at them after sizing up their joints. And Sammy feels tenderness toward them. He idolizes them, especially Queenie, and gets angry after Lengel scolds them and indicates to them that they should have left the store, should not have even entered the store. As readers, we understand and we empathize with Sammy's emotions and his impulse to act on what he feels. He needs to follow through on his initial impulsive gesture of quitting his job in protest and walking out, acting in effect like a protector toward the girls in response to Lengel's response to them. Lengel is a flat character, but he's clearly a moral policeman. He's the superego, or the social impulse to repress. Sammy is acting not only in protest, but in rebellion against Lengel and all that Lengel represents. Sammy describes him as a dreary Sunday school teacher. But his rebellion is also against the repression of eroticism. His act of quitting and walking out is on behalf of, well, a more liberated sexuality. There are strong mythic resonances of Sammy as a would-be knight in this modern supermarket, defending the virtue of a young woman or young women and preserving their honor by way of sacrifice, his job, of Sammy wanting to act heroically. But he's also acting in opposition to the conformity represented by these sheep-like customers, as he sees them, who go from being sheep-like to being, when they witness Sammy's would-be heroic quitting, like sacred pigs in a chute, like scared pigs in a chute. These are the people, Sammy tells us, who haven't seen the ocean in 20 years. Sammy is idealistic, if not foolish, perhaps even puerile in his gesture. But we side with him. We admire him. We do so largely, I believe, out of his belief in a principle and his notion that it is, and what a youthful word to use, fatal not to follow through with a gesture once you begin it. He's cynical in how he views Lengel and the supermarket customers, even bringing up, as I said, the Salem witch trials to describe one of the women customers and derogating the women shoppers and their varicose veins. He's sexist in his view of the girls, comparing their minds to, quote, a little buzz like a bee in a jar, end of quote, and asking if girls even have minds. By today's standards, none of these attitudes of Sammy's are politically correct. In fact, they're downright misogynistic. But Sammy, nonetheless, is likable. He's boyish. He's genuine and imaginative. And his voice captures us as he establishes nicknames for the three girls, who he refers to ultimately as my girls, as if he has a kind of possession over them, as if he wants to claim them. And as he describes how the shelves are set up, cat and dog food, breakfast cereal, macaroni, rice, raisins, seasoning, spreads, spaghetti, soft drinks, crackers, and cookies aisle. That's all one aisle. It's a sign, really, of Updike's virtuosity that he can take us in this hyphenated cereal sense. And I don't mean the cereal that's on the aisle that you eat. I mean cereal from one cataloging item to the next, to give us, from a boy's point of view, what that shelf actually looks like. He's been down it many times. He's probably given advice about where it is. He's a checkout kid in a supermarket. So that's how he sees it, just all running together like a run-on sentence. Or here's Sammy describing how the cash register sounds, endearing himself to us, really. He says, I punched the no sale tab and the machine whirs peep pull and the drawer splats out. This is a kid, checkout boy after all, who is kind of playing games with how the cash register sounds, listening to it, incorporating the sound in an imaginative way, because to some extent it's a pretty boring job and he has to do those kinds of things to keep his mind active. Or Sammy using the imagery an imaginative boy would use and describing Queenie's chest as being, quote, like a dented sheet of metal tilted in the sun. Or helping us to understand how, from his point of view, the whole supermarket's like a pinball machine, which is probably how a boy might view a supermarket. So we like Sammy. We like him for his imaginativeness, despite or maybe in spite of his callowness. And though the misogyny sometimes presents difficulties, particularly for those of us in our enlightened era, nevertheless, he's a boy, and he's a boy of a particular time and place. Let's look at that place. Let's look at the setting and the era and the class differences, which all play integral parts in this story. The setting is a New England supermarket, as the 1960s dawn, and the time and place are important since there are still vestiges in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts of Puritanism as a new era of liberation begins. And Susan Sontag, the great cultural critic and novelist, made the point that we tend, in the United States at least, to homogenize our decades, to speak about the 60s as if they're one decade. I'm a product of the 60s, that sort of thing, when indeed there was a great deal of heterogeneity, different people from different classes, and she felt it was a mistake to try to make the decade sound monolithic. But the 60s did represent a great deal in the way of liberation, or at least the flight toward self-definition and liberating the self. And remember that this supermarket is 5 miles from the beach and north of Boston, setting up a kind of dichotomy for us of place. Supermarkets are modern places, and this one has an automatic door in it. They're also identifiable with freedom. We see that in Allen Ginsberg's famous 1955 poem, A Supermarket in California, in which Allen Ginsberg is at a supermarket, and lo and behold, who's there with him? Walt Whitman, the poet. But A&P was at one time the largest grocery chain in the United States, really in the world, with a dominant position as a chain in the U.S. market, and a new business model for supermarkets. Was Updike making fun of the whole A&P phenomenon? Well, it certainly was an easy and behemoth target. But the class divide that I alluded to is reflected in Sammy's imagining what Queenie's family looks like from the fancy herring that she buys for them. This is what she takes off the shelf to buy. Contrast in class is to his own working class, family, and it's dramatic. And the gap in class, the chasm between the classes, between Sammy and the Queen, affects Sammy's decision. He's a working class kid reaching toward what he sees as the humiliating treatment of a girl he views as a queen, and not just a queen bee. And in his mind, he's reaching toward making a stand, taking a position. The young girl in her pink bathing suit is not only an object of his lust, she's regal and worthy of veneration and self-sacrifice. I'll go back to the first part of the story again, where we get a sense of his response to Queenie. And he says, she had on a kind of dirty pink, beige maybe, I don't know, bathing suit with a little nubble all over it. And what got me, the straps were down. They were off her shoulders, looped loose around the cool tops of her arms. You wouldn't have known there could have been anything whiter than those shoulders. With the straps pulled off, there was nothing between the top of the suit and the top of her head except just her. This clean, bare plane of the top of her chest down from the shoulder bones. And there's that simile again, like a dented sheet of metal tilted in the light. I mean, it was more than pretty. Well, what we have here is an existential story about a boy who's turned on and who displays a kind of manly sense of courage in a fluorescent lighted electric eye supermarket. Existentialism can be seen in terms of choice. I talked about it in previous lectures with respect to rising secularism, with a sense of isolation, the necessity for a sense of solitary existence, but also goes back in curious ways to link us to Calvinism, because that was a philosophy based on the concept of essence preceding existence, with the theological belief in predestination that we spoke of when we talked about Hawthorne's Young Goodman Brown, while existentialism is just the reverse. It's a philosophy going back to Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, more religious part of it, or Martin Buber, and extending through the works of writers like Sartre and Camus, that posits existence as preceding essence. We are, in other words, the choices we make. And Sammy realizes that he'll feel this particular choice for a lifetime. But the necessity of defining self rests upon the choices we make, the assertion of our will, the ability to carry through an action to completion, and not to act in what Jean Paul Sartre called bad faith. Not to act, in other words, out of concern for the opinion of others, or for institutions, or for parents, or other higher authorities that try to define us instead of our defining ourselves. So we have a story of nonconformity, of self-definition, of existential definition, in the midst of people who Sammy, in his hyperbole and his cutting remarks, tells us would still be checking their shopping list even if dynamite were set off. It's also a story of identity, one of the more contemporary themes of short fiction. Not only a boy moving into the hard world on his own and away from his parents, but also of identifying, curiously enough, with his grandmother and her generation, with the use of her fiddle-dee-doo phrase. He says, well, fiddle-dee-doo, I thought of my grandmother's phrase, when L'Engle was talking to him about the seriousness and the weight of what he had done. There's even an ironic reference in the story to the future of 1990. The story was published in 1961, when, from Sammy's point of view, the Russians might be taking over, and Stokesy managing the Alexander Petrushky Tea Company, versus the present, in which Sammy is free to make a complete gesture of freedom as he hits that no-sell cash register key and quits and turns in his apron. The specter, by the way, of the Russians taking over brings us back to the fact that this is a story set in America at the time of the Cold War. Updike saw America as a country where existential freedom and heroism were still possible, and where ordinary Americans could act in extraordinary ways. You might read a story like this and think, oh, this is another story by a kind of left-leaning author about the 60s and the need for liberation and all of that. Well, it is that in a sense, but Updike tended to be a lot more politically conservative than many of the other writers that we've met or that we'll meet. And what I think needs to be understood here is the sense that Updike had a kind of very human conflict within his own heart against itself. He was in many ways a man who struggled with faith and believed in his Protestant form of religion, was a churchgoer, was a man who struggled with ideas of God in his novels particularly, but who nevertheless felt the pangs of, well, his own sexuality. It comes through in most of his novels. A sense of wanting to liberate his sexuality, which is right at the heart of his story. And that kind of conflict that we see early on in this story, early on as far as Updike is concerned, is really central to what makes a lot of his work as compelling as it is. That is, the desire to conform, to hold a job, to please one's parents, to please one's elders, to please the church, and the need somehow to strike out on one's own, to head toward the territory, as Huck Finn put it at the end of Huckleberry Finn. Which, by the way, brings us to another element of this story which makes it quite unique. And that is, we're seeing a kind of Bildungsroman in miniature. The Bildungsroman was indeed a form of the novel, associated with the novel, of initiation, but beyond that, a kind of growth, even spiritual growth. Wilhelm Meister was one of the first Bildungsromans, but Huckleberry Finn is a Bildungsroman. It's an episodic story of an adventure along the Mississippi River. Huckleberry Finn thinks it's the wrong thing, of course, to help Jim, Nigger Jim as he's called in the text, to escape from slavery, that God will punish him, that he's going against his moral scruples. But at the same time, he feels that it's the right thing to do. Jim is his friend, and he wants to help Jim find freedom. Hemingway once said, in a rather gross generalization, but one which nevertheless is often repeated, that all American literature goes back to the Mississippi River, to that raft, to the vernacular that Twain gave us. And in 1954, before Updike's A&P, a novel was published that was said to be the greatest Bildungsroman since Huckleberry Finn, at least for American literature. It was The Adventures of Augie March by Saul Bellow, which also had this very distinct and unique voice. Here is Updike taking really the form of a Bildungsroman and compressing it into a single story, into a story which is not as long as many of the stories that we've read and discussed. And the world that Updike paints for us in A&P is one of adolescent sexuality and popular culture. Talk about this popular culture in a moment, because it's right there in the supermarket with things like the Hi-Ho crackers. But the adolescent sexuality also takes us to the recognition of what Wordsworth said: child is father to the man. This child, this boy that is represented in the story, will become a man who will be divided in many ways, like Updike's male characters or adult characters. In other words, we're seeing in a nascent way, embryonic way, a way that will be developed later on, but it's there in the story, and it's both implicit and explicit in the story, is that sense of the moral divide. What am I to do in terms of what I desire, what I think is a higher or more noble calling, acting on behalf of women like a knight and all that, as opposed to what is the right thing to do? What is the socially sanctioned thing to do? What is maybe perhaps even the religious or moral thing to do? And Updike, though he really struggled with faith and in many ways was a believer, I think probably most of his life, and doubtless still is, even though his mind was assailed by all of modern physics and all of that, which he brings into his work later on as well, entropy and laws of thermodynamics and things which seem to go against really a strong absolute faith, he still, in later novels, is struggling with a belief in God and a belief in following the sanctions of the church and doing the right thing in terms of conformity, and in many cases even championing what would be considered conservative political points of view. Remember that Updike may have been a working class kid, but he wound up very much a suburban, well, often characterized as WASP country club New Englander. I mentioned the Hi-Ho crackers, though. Notice that in this story, Updike is able to weave in a lot of popular culture. Mention brand names like Kingfish Herring. There is a good deal of that, but we also discover, more importantly, that sense of self-defining action is possible. It may be wrong, it may be a mistake, it may be regretted and rued for the rest of a lifetime, but nevertheless it's possible. And one needs to, it seems, experiment, as this boy does, and that's why we side with him. Updike was able to bring this in in the sense of what had normally been kaleidoscopically represented in the novel in a much more compressed way in the story. And I want to take us to actually the conclusion of the story, where we see what the action really means, and we get a kind of climactic feeling as a result of this final action. I look around for my girls, but they're gone, of course. There wasn't anybody but some young married screaming with their children about some candy they didn't get by the door of a powder blue Falcon station wagon. Looking back in the big windows over the bags of peat moss and aluminum lawn furniture stacked on the pavement, I could see Lengel in my place in the slot checking the sheep through. His face was dark gray and his back stiff, as if he'd just had an injection of iron. And my stomach kind of fell as I felt how hard the world was going to be to me hereafter. This is really a moment of recognition, of epiphany, of self-definition, all of what I've said, but also of real humanity, of a kind of universal humanity that readers can connect with and link to. That moment when you realize that life is going to be hard, that it's going to be tough, that making decisions that fall on your shoulders as an individual are what makes life tough. And we see in this story not only what makes life tough, but we see Updike giving us that binary between the flesh and the spirit. Much of Updike's work really has that divide, the Rabbit Quartet, where we see his character, Harry Angstrom, Rabbit, struggling with the desires of the flesh and erotic drives, carnal impulses, but also longing for, if not a higher spiritual Christian ground, then certainly something that will anchor him in faith. And as is true of so much of Updike's fiction, we're made aware in A&P of the presence of the town church, a congregational church. The last phrase in A&P is significant there. How hard the world was going to be to me hereafter suggests, with the use of the word hereafter, a kind of punishment for poor Sammy, a bringing in of the theological and the possibility, even the likelihood of a reckoning in the life after. Though the emphasis in this story is clearly on the grown-up world of experience that Sammy must enter, a world that awaits him out in the sunshine-filled parking lot, that world of screaming children and station wagons and lawn furniture. So what makes this story a masterpiece is not only what we see of Updike bringing in a compressed way what was in the novel, and very different than Salinger in its way because we have a very ordinary life, but establishing strong motifs and capturing a youthful and genuine, sustained, highly imaginative voice like Salinger did, but also vigorously representing the formation of a boy's identity, not as he goes off into pathology, but as he becomes a man. And the lively and vital animated quality of the narration. And then there's also Updike's sheer virtuosity, the clever pacing, the innovative use of language, especially in Sammy's colloquial use of the vernacular. The story lifts us emotionally. It's easy for us to identify with. Despite the misogyny, and I don't mean to go light with it, which should be seen, however, in the context of a boy's immaturity and the time it was written, it's a story that captures the inner working of a boy in transition to maturity and manhood. And it is precisely that phase of being between those stages of life and moving on into another life sphere through will and action that captures readers and stays with them. Aside from being reminiscent of Hawthorne's famous initiation story of young Goodman Brown with the Puritan associations in the story, it's easy to see connections to other stories of initiation we have focused on before. The young love-driven boy in James Joyce's Araby, the young man in Isaac Babel's My First Goose, Laura in Catherine Mansfield's The Garden Party, and Nick Adams in Ernest Hemingway's The Killers. However, Sammy's voice is sui generis. It's original in its contemporaneity, and it rings true tones out about the vexing stage of life called adolescence. Unlike Laura in Mansfield's story or Nick in Hemingway's, Sammy makes the choice of a clean exit. He's even self-aware of it being a clean exit. And what he realizes is real life, the drama of his life, and the choice he has made to exit from one stage and enter into another. Nick decided to leave after encountering Ole Anderson, and Sammy's decision is not fraught with death like Laura's experience or Nick's by the shadow of death. We see our own youthful choices mirrored. Ordinary rather than death-induced choices, choices for better or worse that have moved us into the hard world of adulthood, a place difficult for every one of us, and one often tempered by the wisdom of self-knowledge. So we move on to another story of self-knowledge and identity and a different form of initiation. As a new, more global and cross-cultural era begins to take shape and the canon changes to include more ethnic and women's voices of diversity, we see storytellers emerge like Maxine Hong Kingston, author of a collection of semi-autobiographic tales called The Woman Warrior. She presents us with an initiation story which comes from a story her young Chinese-American protagonist, Little Dog, is told by her mother so that it crosses continents, and she crosses the Rubicon of menstruation into young womanhood. It's the story of her aunt, her father's sister, and what occurred years before in China that caused that aunt to be erased from the family's history and from memory.